There is a building in Rome that most people will never enter. Not because it is dangerous, exactly. Not because it is secret in the way spy movies use that word. But because access requires a kind of permission that very few people ever receive. And even those who do receive it are only allowed to see certain things. In certain rooms under certain conditions. The Vatican Apostolic Archive holds somewhere around 53 miles of shelving. 53 miles, that is not a metaphor. That is just the physical length of the documents stored there. The centuries of correspondence, papal decisions, records of trials, letters from kings who no longer have kingdoms. And somewhere inside all of that, there are files that have never been opened to the public. Not because they are empty, but because apparently, whatever is inside them has been considered too sensitive, too complicated, or too something for the rest of us to read. That is where we begin tonight. Most buildings tell you what they are. A library has signs. A courthouse has steps that feel deliberate formal, like they are asking you to take them seriously. Even a prison communicates its purpose before you ever reach the door. The Apostolic Palace in Vatican City does not work that way. It sits inside one of the smallest sovereign states in the world. Vatican City is roughly 110 acres. That is smaller than many city parks. And yet inside that space, there is an institution that has been accumulating written records since at least the early medieval period. Possibly longer, depending on how you count the earlier collections that fed into it. The archive we are talking about tonight did not appear all at once. It grew slowly. The way things grow when no one is in a hurry and everyone expects to be around for a very long time. The official name is the Archivio Apostolico Vaticano. For most of its history, it was called the Vatican Secret Archive, which sounds dramatic until you understand that the word secret in that context was a translation of the Latin secretum, which meant something closer to private or personal, not hidden in the conspiratorial sense, more like a filing cabinet that belongs to one specific office and is not meant to be browsed by strangers. That is the official explanation, anyway. The rebranding happened in 2019. Pope Francis changed the name to the Apostolic Archive, apparently to reduce the misleading connotations of the word secret. Whether that has actually changed public perception is a different question. But here is what the name change did not alter. The archive still controls its own access. Researchers who want to study documents there must apply in advance. Provide credentials explain their area of study, and receive formal approval once inside. They can request specific documents from specific time periods. They cannot simply browse. They cannot take photographs in the old sections without permission. They work at tables in designated rooms. And the documents are brought to them by staff who know the collection in ways that outside scholars never fully will. That arrangement is not unusual for archives of this age and sensitivity. Many national archives work similarly. What makes the Vatican Archive different is the sheer scope of what it holds, and the fact that the institution that controls it has a continuous history, unlike almost any other organization on Earth. Think about that for a moment. Most governments have collapsed, been replaced, been restructured, been renamed. The Roman Catholic Church, as a formal institution with a centralized authority in Rome, has existed in a recognizable form for roughly 17 centuries. The archive reflects that continuity. It holds documents from popes who lived before most of the countries in Europe existed in their current form. It holds correspondence from figures who are now considered historical legends. It holds records of decisions that shaped the lives of millions of people who never knew the decisions were being made. And it holds all of that in one place under one set of rules, administered by one institution that answers primarily to itself. That is not an accusation, it is just the shape of the thing. The earliest surviving documents in the collection date from around the 8th century. There are references to even older records, but many of those were lost over time, destroyed by fires, floods, or simple deterioration. What has survived is still extraordinary papal bulls, which are formal decrees issued under a lead seal, consistorial acts, which record the formal decisions of the College of Cardinals, registers of correspondence, diplomatic records, records of ecclesiastical trials, financial accounts going back centuries. In terms of physical scale, the estimate that tends to circulate is around 53 miles of shelving. Some sources say 85 kilometers. The exact figure depends on what you count and how you measure. But the point is that no single researcher could read it all in multiple lifetimes. No team of researchers has ever read all of it. There are documents in the collection that have not been handled since they were filed, possibly centuries ago. That is the part that stays with you if you think about it too long. Not that anything is being actively hidden, but that the archive is simply too large, too old, and too complex for anyone to fully know what is inside it. The institution itself may not know everything it holds, which means that whatever is in there, no one has a complete inventory. The archive is housed across several interconnected buildings and underground bunkers beneath the palace complex. Some of the newer storage facilities were built specifically to control temperature and humidity, because paper deteriorates under the wrong conditions. And the Vatican has learned over centuries that preservation is not passive. You have to work at it, the bunker, as it is sometimes called internally, was constructed in the 1980s and uses climate-controlled storage to protect the most fragile materials. Rows of metal shelving in a sealed environment beneath the papal apartments. There is something quietly strange about that image if you let it settle. Ancient documents stored in a modern underground facility are protected by technology that the people who wrote those documents could not have imagined. Letters written by hand with ink made from oak galls and iron sulfate, now kept at a precise 17 degrees Celsius. The people who work there every day probably do not find it strange anymore. That is how it is with places that hold extraordinary things. The extraordinary becomes ordinary for the people who are always around it. But for the rest of us looking in from outside, the question remains, what exactly is in there? For most of its history, the answer to that question was simply list officially. The archive was a working repository for the administrative records of the Holy See. It was not a museum, it was not a library in the public sense. It was the filing system of a sovereign religious institution. And like any filing system, it was meant for internal use. That changed at least partially in 1881. Pope Leo XIII made a decision that was, by the standards of the institution, genuinely radical. He opened the archive to outside scholars, not completely, not without restrictions. But he allowed accredited researchers from universities and historical institutions to apply for access and, if approved, to study documents from certain periods and certain collections. The stated reason was that the Church had nothing to fear from honest historical inquiry. That history properly understood would support rather than undermine the Church's record. That is a confident position to take when you are sitting on centuries of documents you have not fully reviewed yourself. The response from the academic world was significant. The historians who had spent careers working from second-hand accounts, or from copies of copies, or from documents that had been filtered through other institutions, suddenly had the possibility of accessing primary sources. The kind of sources that could confirm or complicate or entirely reframe what was understood about medieval and early modern European history. Some of what they found was exactly what you would expect. Administrative records, routine correspondence. The bureaucratic residue of a large institution managing its affairs across centuries. Not everything in the archive is momentous. A lot of it is ordinary, the way most records are ordinary. Inventories, appointment notices, correspondence about local church disputes that were resolved and forgotten within a generation. But some of what they found was not ordinary. And some of what they wanted to find was not available. The access that Leo XIII granted was structured around time periods. Initially, researchers could access documents up to a certain date. That cutoff has moved forward over the years, as subsequent popes have opened additional collections. Pope Francis in 2020 opened the files related to Pope Pius XII, which covered the period of the Second World War. That opening had been anticipated for years, and we will spend considerable time in it later in this script. But the point is that even now, even after more than 140 years of partial access, the archive is not fully open. There are collections that remain restricted. There are time periods where access is limited or requires special dispensation. There are categories of document, particularly those related to ongoing canonical processes or living individuals, that are sealed as a matter of policy. What is harder to know is whether the restricted sections contain what some researchers suspect they contain. The archive does not publish a complete catalog of its holdings. There is an index, and there are finding aids for some collections. But there is no comprehensive public list of every document in the archive, which means that what is in the restricted sections is, in a very practical sense, unknown to anyone outside the institution. That is not a conspiracy. That is just the reality of an archive that has never been fully catalogued. But it does create a particular kind of uncertainty. Because without a complete inventory, you cannot know what questions to ask. You cannot request a document if you do not know it exists. And you cannot know it exists if the institution that holds it has not told you. There is a word for this in archival theory. It is called the archive's power to define the record. The institution that controls what is kept, what is indexed, and what is made accessible also controls it, at least in part. What can be known, not through active suppression necessarily, though that is possible, but simply through the structure of access itself. Researchers who have worked in the Vatican archive describe the experience in ways that are consistently interesting. Most of them say the staff are professional and helpful within the constraints of the rules. Most of them say the physical experience of handling documents that old is something that stays with you. One historian described receiving a document that included a wax seal from the 13th century, still partially intact, and said that for a moment the distance between that century and this one seemed to collapse in a way that was hard to explain rationally. But most of them also describe the frustration of finding gaps, of following a thread of correspondence and reaching a point where the next document in the sequence is listed as restricted, or simply not listed at all. Of knowing that the answer to a specific historical question is almost certainly somewhere in that building, and not being permitted to look for it. That frustration is not unique to the Vatican archive. It is the frustration of anyone who has worked seriously with restricted historical records anywhere in the world. But it carries a particular weight here, because the institution involved is not a government that might eventually declassify records under a Freedom of Information law. The Vatican is a sovereign entity with its own rules, and those rules do not include any mechanism by which outside pressure can compel disclosure. What gets released is released because the Church decides to release it, and what remains sealed for the same reason. That is the foundation of everything that follows in this script. Not that the Vatican is hiding something specific and dramatic, but that the structure of the archive makes it genuinely impossible to know what is and is not there. And that within that uncertainty, within those 53 miles of shelving and those climate-controlled bunkers beneath the papal apartments, there are almost certainly documents that would change, or at least complicate our understanding of history. The question is not whether those documents exist. The question is whether we will ever be allowed to read them. That question does not have an answer tonight. But we can follow the edges of it. The places where something was found that was not supposed to be found. Or where something was released that raised more questions than it answered. Or where the gap between what the archive holds and what the public knows is just wide enough to see through. Slightly if you look at the right angle. That is what the rest of this is. Just looking carefully at the right angle. The word Inquisition carries a weight that makes it difficult to think about clearly. It arrives already loaded, already attached to images and assumptions that have accumulated over centuries of retelling. Torture chambers, heresy trials. The idea of an institution so certain of its own righteousness that it felt justified in doing almost anything to protect it. Some of that is accurate. Some of it is significantly exaggerated. And some of the exaggeration was itself deliberate. Produced by political enemies of the Catholic Church during the Reformation and afterward, who had their own reasons for making the Inquisition sound as monstrous as possible. The truth is, it usually does. Sits somewhere more complicated than either the horror story or the defense. What matters for tonight is this. The Inquisition generated records. Enormous quantities of records, transcripts of trials, depositions, lists of accusations, records of sentences. A correspondence between inquisitors and Rome. Registers of cases opened investigate concluded, or left unresolved for centuries. Those records sat in the archive of the institution that had produced them, which eventually became what is now called the Archive of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. That is the modern name for the office that was once the supreme sacred congregation of the Roman and Universal Inquisition. The same office, different name, several times over. The records of that office are not held in the main Apostolic Archive. They are held separately, in the archive of the congregation itself, which is housed in the Palace of the Holy Office, just outside the walls of Vatican City proper. Access to those records has historically been even more restricted than access to the main archive, and for reasons that are not difficult to understand. The Inquisition tried people. It made judgments about their beliefs, their behaviors, their relationships, and their deaths. It produced records that implicate real historical figures, including figures who were later canonized as saints, in decisions that by contemporary moral standards range from troubling to indefensible. Opening those records fully would mean opening the institution to a level of historical scrutiny that goes beyond academic interest. For a long time, the answer was simply not to open them, then. In 1998, Pope John Paul II authorized a partial opening of the Inquisition archive to a group of historians. It was framed as part of a broader effort toward historical transparency in preparation for the year 2000, which the Church had designated as a Jubilee year, a time of reflection and, in some cases, an acknowledgement of historical wrongs. The group of historians who were granted access produced a substantial report. It was published in 2004 under the title El Inquisizione, and it attempted to draw conclusions from what the researchers had found in those records. What they found was genuinely significant, though perhaps not in the way popular imagination would expect. The records showed that the Inquisition, at least in its Roman form, was in many respects more procedurally careful than secular courts of the same period. Defendants had the right to present witnesses. Confessions obtained under torture were required to be repeated voluntarily the following day to be considered valid. The sentences of death were relatively rare compared to the total number of cases. And when death sentences were handed down, they were carried out by secular authorities, not the Church directly. A distinction the Church has always maintained and secular historians have always found somewhat technical. None of that makes the Inquisition defensible by modern standards. But it does complicate the cartoon version of what it was. What the report also showed more quietly was that the archive was not fully accessible even to that specially appointed group of historians. There were sections they were not shown. There were categories of record that remained off limits. The report acknowledged these gaps without dwelling on them, which is itself a kind of careful professional discretion. One of the most discussed cases in the context of the Inquisition archive is Galileo Galilei. Galileo was tried by the Inquisition in 1633 on suspicion of heresy, specifically for his support of the Copernican model of the solar system, which placed the sun rather than the earth at the center. He was found guilt-forced to recant, and spent the remainder of his life under house arrest. He died in 1642. His trial file sat in the Inquisition archive for centuries. It was one of the most discussed and most requested documents in the history of the archive, and for a very long time access was simply not granted. The scholars worked from copies from second-hand accounts, from documents that had been produced by people who had themselves only partial access to the original record. When the file was finally made available to researchers, and when a facsimile edition was eventually published, what they found was both clarifying and strange. The file confirmed the basic outline of what was already known. Galileo had been tried, he had recanted. The sentence had been carried out. But it also revealed something that had not been widely understood before. The documentation of the trial contained an irregularity. A document in the file, a report of what Galileo had allegedly been told in a 1616 meeting with Cardinal Bellarmine. It existed in a form that some scholars found suspicious. The document in question stated that Galileo had been explicitly forbidden from holding a teaching defending the Copernican theory in any way. But there was no signature on it. In an archive full of formally witnessed and signed documents, this one was unsigned, and the signed document from the same meeting is the one bearing Cardinal Bellarmine's actual name. It said something slightly different. It said Galileo had been informed of the Church's position, not that he had been explicitly forbidden in the absolute terms described in the unsigned version. That discrepancy matters because the 1633 trial rested significantly on whether Galileo had violated a specific prohibition. If the prohibition was documented in an unsigned and possibly irregular document, then the legal basis of the trial becomes more complicated than the official record suggests. Some historians have argued the unsigned document was a forgery, inserted into the file at some point between 1616 and 1633 to strengthen the case against Galileo. Others have argued it was a genuine draft that was simply never finalized. The archive holds both documents. The debate has not been resolved. What is resolved is that the file existed, that it was kept sealed for a very long time, and that when it was finally read, it raised questions that the sealed version could not raise. That pattern of a document being released and generating new uncertainty rather than resolving old uncertainty is one that repeats itself throughout the history of this archive. It is almost a kind of rhythm. Something is sealed. Scholars request access. Access is eventually granted, partially. What is found does not close the question. It opens a different one, and somewhere further back in the shelving, in a section not yet opened, there may be the document that answers that question. Or there may not be. There is no way to know. That is the thing about an archive this large and this old. It contains the answers to questions that have not been asked yet. And it probably contains the questions that answers we already were designed to prevent. There is a case that does not get discussed as often as Galileo, but which sits in a quieter and in some ways more unsettling part of the Inquisition record. The case of Giordano Bruno. Bruno was a Dominican friar, a philosopher and, by any reasonable assessment, an extraordinarily restless thinker. He believed in an infinite universe. He believed that stars were distant suns, each potentially with their own planets. He believed that the soul transmigrated between bodies. He rejected the doctrine of the Trinity in its orthodox form. He wrote and spoke and moved across Europe, staying in one place until his ideas made him unwelcome. Then moving on, he was arrested by the Inquisition in 1593. He was held for 8 years, and in February of 1600, he was burned alive in the Campo de' Fiori in Rome. The Vatican has never fully released the records of his trial. What exists publicly is partial. Some documents have been described by researchers who accessed portions of the file. A summary of the charges was reconstructed in the 19th century by a historian named Angelo Mercati, who was granted limited access to the Inquisition archive and published what he found. But the complete trial transcript, if it survives, has not been made fully available. The Church's position has generally been that Bruno was condemned not for his scientific ideas, but for his theological ones. His denial of the Trinity, his views on the soul, his rejection of doctrines that were, by the standards of his time, foundational, the burning. In this framing was a religious matter, not a scientific one. That distinction matters to the Church because the Galileo case already represents one deeply uncomfortable chapter in the relationship between Catholic authority and scientific inquiry. A second case in which a man was executed for ideas that later proved scientifically accurate would complicate the institutional narrative considerably. Whether the full Bruno trial record would change or confirm the official account is something that cannot be determined without reading it. And reading it has not been permitted. This is not a unique situation. There are other cases in the Inquisition archive that remain similarly restricted. Cases involving figures who are now considered important historical or intellectual figures, whose trial records would be of significant scholarly interest, but which have not been opened. Some of these restrictions are explained by ongoing canonical processes, meaning the Church is considering or has considered the person for canonization or some other official status, and the trial record is considered relevant to that internal process. Some restrictions are explained by the sensitivity of the individuals or institutions implicated in the records. Some are not explained at all, at least not publicly. What researchers who have worked in or adjacent to the Inquisition archive tend to say, when they speak carefully, is that the gaps are not random. The documents that are missing or restricted are not evenly distributed across time and subject matter. They cluster around certain periods, certain types of cases, certain individuals whose reputations, or whose connection to the Church's own institutional history are particularly complex. That clustering could mean several things. It could mean that those documents were selectively preserved because they were considered important, which would make their restriction more deliberate. It could mean that those documents were selectively destroyed at some point, which would make their absence a different kind of statement. Or it could mean that the clustering is a coincidence, an artifact of how records were kept and organized across centuries of changing administrative practice. All three explanations are possible. The archive does not clarify which is correct. There is one more dimension to the Inquisition records that is worth sitting with before we move on. The geographic scope of what those records contain. The Inquisition was not only a Roman institution. It operated across Catholic Europe and eventually in the colonial territories of Catholic powers. The Spanish Inquisition, which was technically separate from the Roman Inquisition and operated under the Spanish crown rather than directly under the Pope, generated its own enormous body of records. Many of those records are held in the National Historical Archive in Madrid, not in Rome, but the correspondence between the Spanish Inquisition and Rome. The letters, reports, the requests for guidance. Much of that passed through Rome, and some portion of it is in the Vatican Archive. What that means is that the archive holds pieces of a much larger picture. Pieces of the history of religious persecution across an entire continent over several centuries. Individual cases, individual names, individual accusations and sentences, scattered across thousands of documents in dozens of collections. Some of those names would be recognized. Some of them would surprise people who think they know the history well. And some of them are names of people whose descendants are still alive, whose family histories would be changed by what the archive contains. The archive is not just a collection of old paper. It is a collection of consequences, of decisions that were made about real people, decisions that had permanent effects on those people and on everyone connected to them. And the institution that made those decisions is the same institution that now controls access to the record of them. That is not a comfortable arrangement. It has never been a comfortable arrangement. But it is the arrangement that exists. And it has existed for a very long time. There was a moment, during the research for the historical report published in 2004, when one of the participating scholars was asked in an interview what surprised him most about what he found in the Inquisition archive. He paused for a moment before answering. Then he said that what surprised him was not the cruelty, which he had expected and found. What surprised him was the orderliness, the careful documentation, the procedural attention to detail, the fact that the institution had kept such meticulous records of what it had done. He said it suggested that the people involved did not think they were doing something wrong. They thought they were doing something necessary. And they documented it the way you document something necessary, thoroughly without apology. That observation stays with you, because it raises a question that goes beyond the Inquisition specifically. It is a question about institutions in general, about what happens when an organization with absolute certainty about its own righteousness is also the organization that controls the record of its own actions. The answer to that question is somewhere in those 53 miles of shelving, or it is in the building next door, in the archive of the congregation that used to be called the Inquisition, in the sections that have not yet been opened. Either way, it is not available tonight, but it is there. Sometimes the most significant discoveries happen because someone puts something in the wrong place. In 2001, the Vatican archivist named Barbara Frail was working through a collection of documents that had been filed under a reference code related to the Kingdom of Aragon. She was looking for something else entirely. Something routine. The kind of document retrieval that archivists do dozens of times in a week without expecting to find anything unexpected. And then she found a parchment that had been sitting in the wrong section for approximately 700 years. It was called the Chinon Parchment, named after the town of Chinon in France, where the events it describes took place. The document is dated August 17th through 20th, 1308. It is a record of a papal investigation, signed by 3 cardinals acting on behalf of Pope Clement V. And it concerns one of the most mythologized groups in medieval history, the Knights Templar. Before we go further, it is probably worth slowing down and making sure the basic history is clear. Because the Templars have been the subject of so much fiction and speculation that the actual historical record sometimes gets buried underneath the mythology. The Knights Templar were a religious military order founded around 1119. Their stated purpose was to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land following the First Crusade. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience like monks. But they also trained as soldiers and fought in the Crusades. Over time, they became extraordinarily wealthy and politically powerful. They developed a banking system that allowed nobles to deposit money in one Templar house and withdraw it in another, which was a genuinely innovative financial structure for the medieval period. They owned land across Europe. They answered directly to the Pope, not to local bishops or kings, and then in October of 1307, King Philip IV of France ordered the arrest of every Templar in France on charges of heresy, idolatry, and various other offenses that ranged from plausible to absurd. The timing was not coincidental. Philip was deeply in debt to the Templars. Arresting them allowed him to seize their assets, but to make the seizure legally defensible, he needed the arrests to appear justified, which meant he needed confessions. And to obtain confessions, his officials used torture. Under torture, the arrested Templars confessed to a variety of things: denying Christ, spitting on the cross during initiation ceremonies, worshipping an idol called Baphomet, engaging in obscene rituals. The confessions were inconsistent, contradictory, and obtained under conditions that by any modern standard would render them legally worthless. But in the early 14th century, confessions obtained under torture were considered valid evidence, especially if they were later repeated voluntarily. Many of the Templars retracted their confessions once the torture stopped. Some of them did not, either because they feared further torture or because the experience had broken something in them that could not be reassembled. Pope Clement V was placed in a very difficult position. Philip was pressuring him to condemn the Templars. But the Templars were a papal order, which meant they were technically under the Pope's protection. Clement could not simply ignore the accusations without appearing weak or complicit. But he also could not condemn the Templars based solely on confessions obtained by a secular king using methods the Church itself found questionable. So he sent his own investigators. The 3 cardinals were dispatched to Chinon, where some of the most senior Templars were being held. The cardinals were instructed to investigate the charges, to hear testimony directly from the Templar leadership, and to determine whether the order as a whole should be condemned or whether individual members could be absolved. That investigation happened in August of 1308. The cardinals questioned the Templar leaders, including the Grand Master Jacques de Molay. And at the end of the investigation, the cardinals issued a formal record of their findings. That record was the Chinon Parchment, and then it disappeared, not destroyed apparently. Just misfiled, placed in the wrong collection, or possibly moved during one of the many reorganizations of the archive over the centuries, and never returned to the correct reference code, which meant that when historians in later centuries went looking for documentation of the papal investigation into the Templars. They did not find it. They found other documents. Correspondence summaries. Papal bulls related to the eventual dissolution of the order, but not the direct record of what the cardinals had concluded. The absence of that record had consequences. It meant that the dominant historical narrative about the end of the Templars was shaped primarily by the accounts that did survive, which were produced by the French crown and by sources sympathetic to King Philip's version of events. The narrative became that the Templars were guilty, or at least guilty enough, and that the Pope had gone along with their condemnation because he had no real choice. That narrative is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete. Barbara Fraile found the document that complicates it. The Chinon Parchment records that the three cardinals did find evidence of misconduct among some Templars. The Specificology found that during initiation rituals, some members of the order had been required to ritually deny Christ and spit on the cross, not as genuine acts of heresy, but as tests of obedience. The idea, according to the testimony, was to simulate what a Templar might be forced to do if captured by enemies, to see if the initiate would obey orders even under morally unbearable conditions. That practice, even understood in context, was unacceptable by church standards. It violated the sanctity of the sacraments and constituted a form of blasphemy, even if it was not intended as genuine apostasy. But the cardinals also found that the Templar leadership, when questioned directly, expressed regret for the practice, acknowledged that it was wrong and sought absolution. And the cardinals, acting under the authority granted to them by Pope Clement, granted that absolution. That is what the Chinon Parchment says. The Templar leaders were absolved, not exonerated entirely, not declared innocent of all charges, but absolved in the formal sacramental sense. Their sins were forgiven. They were reconciled with the Church, which means that when Pope Clement later dissolved the Templar order in 1312, he did so not because the leadership had been found guilty of heresy by his own investigators, but for other reasons, political reasons most likely. Reasons related to the pressure from Philip and the broader instability the accusations had created. The dissolution was framed as a matter of prudence, not justice. The order was suppressed. Its assets were transferred to another military order, and its members were theoretically allowed to join other religious communities, though in practice many of them were imprisoned or executed by secular authorities. And the document that showed the leadership had been absolved was filed incorrectly and sat unread in the archive for 7 centuries. When Barbara Fraile published her findings, the response from the historical community was significant but also carefully measured. The Chinon Parchment was genuine. The seals were authentic. The handwriting matched other documents from the same period and the same papal chancery. There was no serious dispute about the document's legitimacy. But what the document meant, and what it changed about the established history was less clear. Some historians argued that the parchment fundamentally altered the narrative. It showed that the Pope's own investigators had not found the Templars guilty of the most serious charges. It showed that the leadership had been absolved. It suggested that the dissolution of the order was a political act, not a doctrinal one, and that the Church had been pressured into destroying an order that its own process had not condemned. Other historians were more cautious. They pointed out that absolution is not the same as exoneration. The cardinals had found evidence of problematic practices. The fact that they granted forgiveness did not mean the practices had not occurred. And the dissolution of the order, even if it was politically motivated, was still carried out under papal authority. And Clement signed the bull that suppressed the Templars. Whether he did so reluctantly or not does not change the fact that he did it. Both positions are defensible. Both are supported by the document itself, depending on which parts you emphasize. What is harder to defend is the idea that the misfiling of the Chinon parchment was purely accidental. It is possible archives are human institutions. All humans make mistakes. A document placed in the wrong file box. A reference code copied incorrectly. A reorganization that moved materials without updating the index. All of that happens. It has happened in every archive that has ever existed. But this particular document, related to one of the most politically sensitive episodes in medieval church history, filed incorrectly in a way that kept it out of sight for 700 years. In an archive that was otherwise extremely careful about maintaining records of papal authority and legal proceedings, raises a question that is difficult to ignore. Was it misfiled or was it refiled? There is no evidence to support the idea that it was deliberately hidden. But there is also no evidence to disprove it. What exists is the fact of the document's absence from the record for centuries, and the fact of its eventual rediscovery in a section where it should not have been. The Vatican's response to the discovery was measured. In 2007, the parchment was published in a limited facsimile edition as part of a larger collection of documents related to the Templars. Pope Benedict XVI acknowledged the historical significance of the find. The official position was that the document clarified an important moment in church history and demonstrated the care with which the medieval papacy approached accusations of heresy, even under political pressure. That position is not unreasonable, but it also sidesteps a more uncomfortable question. If the Chinon parchment had been properly filed and accessible to historians in the 16th, 17th, 18th, or 19th centuries, would the history of the Templars have been written differently? Would the mythology that grew up around them, the legends of hidden treasure and secret knowledge and conspiracies that reached into the foundations of European power, would any of that have taken the shape it did if the actual record of their absolution had been publicly known? Probably not. The mythology of the Templars is built largely on the idea that they were destroyed unjustly, that they possessed something dangerous or valuable enough to justify their annihilation, and that the truth of what they knew or what they had was covered up by the authorities who eliminated them. The absence of the Chinon parchment from the historical record supported that mythology, because it left a gap, a missing piece, a silence where there should have been an explanation. And into that silence, people projected their own ideas about what must have happened. Some of that projection was harmless storytelling. Novels, films, games. The kind of cultural myth-making that happens around any historical mystery. But some of it was not harmless. Some of it fed into conspiratorial thinking that has had real consequences. The idea that secret societies control history. The idea that the Church and European monarchies collaborated to suppress dangerous truths. The idea that documentation cannot be trusted because the institutions that produce documentation are themselves corrupt. Those ideas are older than the Templar mythology, and they would exist without it. But the Templars became a kind of narrative anchor for those ideas. A historical case that seemed to prove the point. And the document that might have complicated that narrative was sitting in the wrong section of the archive, unseen for 7 centuries. It is worth asking what else might be sitting there. Not necessarily misfiled in the accidental sense, but archived in a way that makes it effectively invisible unless someone happens to be looking in exactly the right place for exactly the right thing. The Vatican Archive does not have a comprehensive searchable index of every document it holds. There is no digital database where you can enter a keyword and retrieve every mention of a subject across all collections. The finding aids that exist are often specific to particular collections, and they were created at different times by different people using different organizational principles, which means that discovering something like the Chinon parchment requires a combination of expertise, success, time, and luck. You have to know enough about the archive's structure to know where something might be. You have to be granted access to that section. You have to be given enough time to work through the material carefully. And you have to be looking at the right moment, is in the right frame of mind, to recognize that what you are seeing is significant. Barbara Frail had all of those things. And she found a document that changed, or at least complicated a 700-year-old story. But she was looking for something else when she found it. Which raises the question of what someone might find if they were looking deliberately. If they had full access. If they had time to work through not just one collection, but all of them. As if the archive were truly open. Not in the limited sense of allowing credentialed researchers to request specific documents, but open in the sense that a national archive is open, where the default is accessibility unless there is a specific and documented reason for restriction. That kind of openness has never existed at the Vatican, and there is no indication that it will exist in the foreseeable future. The Chinon parchment is now part of the historical record. It has been studied, it has been debated. It has been incorporated into more recent scholarship about the Templars and about the medieval church's relationship with secular power. But it was not part of the record for most of the time that record has existed. And the reason it was not part of the record is that it was somewhere else. Not destroyed, not explicitly suppressed. Just somewhere else in an archive of 53 miles. Somewhere else is a large category. Large enough that there are almost certainly other documents, other parchments, other records of decisions and investigations and correspondences that would change or complicate what is currently understood. Some of those documents may be misfiled. Some of them may be filed exactly where they were intended to be filed. And some of them may be in sections that have never been opened to anyone outside the institution. The Chinon parchment is not evidence of a conspiracy, but it is evidence of something almost more unsettling. It is evidence that the archive contains things the archive itself does not fully know it contains, and that what we think we know about history is in some cases what we have been able to know based on the documents we have been able to see, which is not the same thing as what actually happened. It is just the version that survived in the right file. There is a collection within the archive that deals with Napoleon Bonaparte, and the letters in that collection are strange for a different reason. Not because of what they say, but because of the physical fact of their existence in that particular place. In 1809, Napoleon invaded the Papal States. He had already crowned himself Emperor of France in the presence of Pope Pius VII, in a ceremony that was supposed to demonstrate papal approval of his rule, but which Napoleon famously disrupted by taking the crown from the Pope's hands and placing it on his own head. The relationship between Napoleon and the papacy was never simple. He knighted the church's legitimacy, but he resented its independence. When Pius refused to cooperate with Napoleon's continental system, a trade blockade against Britain, Napoleon responded by annexing the Papal States. Rome was occupied by French troops, and the Pope was arrested. Pius VII was held under house arrest, first in Savona and later in Fontainebleau, for nearly 5 years during that time. He was pressured repeatedly to concede to Napoleon's demands regarding the appointment of bishops and the governance of the church in French-controlled territories. Pius resisted. Despite his isolation, and despite the fact that Napoleon controlled almost all of continental Europe. But what is less widely known is that, during the occupation, Napoleon also seized the Vatican Archive. He ordered the entire archive to be packed up and transported to Paris. The stated reason was that it was part of the cultural patrimony of the empire. But the actual reason was almost certainly strategic. Napoleon understood that the archive contained documentation of centuries of papal authority, and treaties and courts legal precedents. Controlling that documentation meant controlling the historical basis of claims the church might make against him. The archive was transported in sections over several years. The thousands of crates, entire collections moved by cart and barge through France. Some of the material was damaged in transit, some was lost. But much of it arrived in Paris and was housed in the French National Archives. Napoleon fell in 1814. The Papal States were restored. And the archive was supposed to be returned. It was mostly. But not completely. Some portions of the archive were never returned. Some were returned but in damaged or incomplete condition. Some documents that had been in the Vatican archive before 1809 are now in Paris. And they have remained there despite requests for repatriation. The question of which institution legally owns certain documents from that period has never been fully resolved. What did return included correspondence between Napoleon and the Vatican. Letters from Napoleon to Pius. Letters from Pius to Napoleon. Letters from cardinals trying to negotiate terms. Letters that were written during the years when the Pope was a prisoner and Napoleon was attempting to force concessions that would make the Church subordinate to the Empire. Those letters are remarkable for their restraint. Pius did not write like a man who believed he had any leverage. He wrote like a man who believed his authority came from somewhere Napoleon could not touch, and that as long as he held to that authority, Napoleon's power over him was limited to the physical. Napoleon could imprison him. Napoleon could not make him pope of a state church. The letters show Napoleon becoming increasingly frustrated with that position. He was used to negotiation. He was used to force working. And here was an elderly man with no Armino territory. No political power in any conventional sense. Who simply would not agree. Eventually, Napoleon gave up. Not because Pius convinced him, but because by 1814, Napoleon had larger problems. And the cost of continuing to hold the Pope was no longer worth the benefit. Pius returned to Rome. The archive returned to Rome mostly. And the correspondence became part of the historical record. Though not immediately accessible, it took decades before researchers could examine those letters in any detail. What they show is something that the institutional church has always wanted to emphasize. That even under coercion, under occupation, the papacy maintained its independence. That temporal power is not the same as spiritual authority. That is true in a sense. But the letters also show something the Church has been less eager to emphasize. That maintaining spiritual authority required making enormous compromises in practice. Pius could not appoint bishops in French territories without Napoleon's approval. He could not communicate freely with the rest of the Church. His ability to govern the institution he was supposed to lead was almost entirely curtailed for years. Spiritual authority without practical power is a real thing. But it is also a limited thing. The letters document that limitation very clearly. There is one more category of letter worth mentioning before we leave this chapter. Letters that were sent to the Vatican asking for help that did not come. These are harder to discuss because they are more scattered, less well documented and, in many cases, still restricted. But researchers who have worked in sections of the archive related to the Second World War or to the periods of religious persecution in various parts of Europe have described finding letters from individuals and communities who wrote to Rome describing what was happening to them and asking for intervention. Some of those letters were from Jewish communities in Nazi-occupied territories, writing to the Pope or to Vatican officials, describing deportations and massacres, and asking the Church to speak publicly or to use its diplomatic influence. Some of those letters were from Catholic clergy in countries under communist rule, describing arrests, trials, executions, and asking for support or at minimum for acknowledgement. And some of those letters received replies, careful, diplomatic replies that expressed sympathy but did not commit to action. And some of them received no reply at all, at least none that has been found in the record. The question of what the Vatican could have done and what it should have done in those situations is complicated. The Church did not have military power. Its diplomatic influence was real but limited. Public statements risked making situations worse. Or so the argument went. There were cases where intervention happened quietly, where convents sheltered refugees, where Vatican diplomats issued papers that allowed people to escape. Those cases are documented and they are significant. But there were also cases where nothing was done, where the letters were filed and the people who wrote them died. And those letters are still in the archive. They sit in collections that are now partially accessible, though not fully. Researchers can request them sometimes, but the process is slow and the access is limited. And the question of why certain letters were answered and certain letters were not is something the archive does not clarify. What it does is preserve them. The letters nobody was supposed to read, written by people who believed that writing to Rome might make a difference, filed away in sections organized by date and subject and geographic origin. Some of those letters are from people whose names are now well known. Most are from people whose names appear nowhere else in the historical record. All of them believe it at the moment they wrote, that someone in the Vatican would read what they had written and respond. Some of them were right and some of them were not. And the archive holds both kinds. There are periods of history where the questions are straightforward, even if the answers are not. And then there are periods where even the questions become complicated, where asking them carefully requires acknowledging that the answer, whatever it turns out to be, will not resolve anything cleanly. The papacy of Pius XII, which ran from 1939 to 1958, is that kind of period. Eugenio Pacelli became pope in March of 1939, 6 months before Germany invaded Poland. He had been Vatican Secretary of State under his predecessor, Pius XI, and had served as papal nuncio to Germany during the 1920s. He spoke German fluently. He had negotiated the Reichskonkordat in 1933. a treaty between the Vatican and Nazi Germany that was supposed to protect the rights of the Catholic Church in German territory in exchange for the Church withdrawing from political activity. That treaty has been debated ever since. Some historians argue it was a pragmatic move that allowed the Church to continue operating under an increasingly hostile regime. Others argue it gave legitimacy to the Nazi government at a moment when international condemnation might have mattered. Both arguments are supported by documentation. Both are probably partially correct. But the treaty is not the main question. The main question is what Pius XII knew about the Holocaust, or when he knew it, and why he did not speak publicly about it in clear and unambiguous terms while it was happening. That question has shaped his legacy more than anything else about his papacy. He has been called Hitler's Pope by critics, a title taken from a controversial biography published in 1999. He has been called a prudent and heroic figure by defenders, who argue that his quiet diplomacy saved thousands of lives and that public condemnation would have led to greater violence against Catholics and Jews alike. The debate has been ongoing for more than 70 years. And in March of 2020, Pope Francis opened the Vatican Archive's files related to Pius XII's papacy. The decision was announced with careful language. The opening was described as an act of transparency, an acknowledgement that enough time had passed for historians to examine the period without the constraints of immediate political sensitivity. Researchers from around the world applied for access. Jewish organizations, Catholic institutions, secular universities. Everyone wanted to see what the files contained. What they contained was millions of pages of documents, correspondence, diplomatic cables, reports from nuncios in occupied territories, internal Vatican memos, records of meetings, financial accounts, letters from individuals asking for help, letters from clergy reporting what they had witnessed, transcripts of papal audiences, drafts of speeches and encyclicals, some of which were delivered and some of which were not. The scale of the material made comprehensive analysis difficult. No single researcher could read all of it. Teams of scholars began working through different sections, different collections, different types of documents. And what they found in the first few years of access was not a single clear answer. What they found was complexity. There is documentation showing that Pius XII was informed, repeatedly and in detail, about what was happening to Jewish populations in Poland, in Germany and occupied territories across Europe. Reports from bishops, reports from nuncios, reports from Catholic organizations working in those areas. The information reached Rome, it was filed. In some cases, it was forwarded to allied governments. In some cases, it was discussed internally. But there is very little documentation showing that Pius issued clear public condemnation of the mass killings while they were happening. He spoke in general terms about the suffering of innocent people. He used language about the rights of all human beings regardless of race. He condemned violence and totalitarianism in broad theological terms. But he did not name the Nazis explicitly. He did not name the Jews explicitly. He did not say, in a way that could not be misunderstood, that what was happening was a systematic attempt to exterminate an entire people, and that it was a moral abomination. The question is why. Chinese letter materials that have been examined so far suggest several overlapping reasons, none of which fully resolve the question, but all of which seem to have been part of his thinking. One reason was fear of reprisal. There is documentation showing that Vatican officials believed a strong public statement condemning the Nazis would lead to increased persecution of Catholics in German-occupied territories. There were millions of Catholics living under Nazi rule. There were priests, bishops, religious orders. A direct papal condemnation might provoke retaliation. That concern was not theoretical. The Nazis had already arrested clergy-closed churches and sent priests to concentration camps. The fear was that a public statement would make that worse. Whether that fear was justified is something historians still argue about. Some point to cases where local bishops did speak out and the reprisals were severe. Others argue that the moral obligation to condemn genocide outweighed the risk of reprisal, and that silence in the face of mass murder cannot be justified by concern for institutional survival. Both positions are defensible. Both assume a set of values about what the Church's role should be in moments of extreme moral crisis. Another reason suggested by some of the documents was a belief that quiet diplomacy was more effective than public statements. There is evidence that the Vatican used its diplomatic network to intervene in specific cases, issuing travel documents, sheltering refugees in church properties, negotiating with local officials to delay deportations, sending money to resistance organizations. Those actions saved lives. Not millions of lives, but lives nonetheless. The argument in favor of that approach is that it achieved concrete results in a way that public statements might not have. The argument against it is that public moral leadership has value beyond immediate practical outcomes, and that the failure to speak clearly allowed people to believe, or to pretend to believe, that the Church did not see what was happening as fundamentally evil. A third reason, less often acknowledged but present in some of the internal documents, seems to have been a concern about maintaining the Vatican's neutrality. The Vatican was officially neutral during the war. It did not take sides between the Allies and the Axis. That neutrality was seen as necessary to preserve the Church's ability to operate globally, to minister to Catholics on both sides of the conflict, and to maintain its role as a moral authority above national politics. But neutrality in the context of the Holocaust was not a morally neutral position. Refusing to condemn one side meant in practice, allowing that side to continue without the weight of papal condemnation. Whether that was a failure of neutrality or an inevitable consequence of it depends on how you understand the Church's responsibility. One of the documents that received significant attention after the archive opened was a draft of an encyclical that Pius XII began writing in 1942 but never completed or published. An encyclical is a formal papal letter, usually addressed to bishops but intended for the wider Church and often the wider world. Encyclicals carry significant weight. When a pope issues one, it represents not just his personal opinion, but the teaching authority of the office. The draft from 1942 was more direct than Pius' public statements had been. It condemned the murder of innocent people based on race or nationality. It used language that, while still not naming the Jews explicitly, it came closer to acknowledging the specific nature of what was happening. It described the actions as violations of divine and natural law. But it was never finished, and it was never published. The reasons why are not entirely clear from the documentation that has been released so far. There are notes in the margin suggestions for revisions, indications that Pius was uncertain about the phrasing. There is correspondence suggesting that some of his advisors thought the encyclical would be ineffective or dangerous. There is no single memo that says, "We decided not to publish this, and here is why." What exists is the draft itself, and the fact that it remained a draft. Some historians have interpreted this as evidence that Pius wanted to speak more clearly, but was talked out of it by advisors who were more cautious. Others have interpreted it as evidence that Pius himself was uncertain, that he drafted the encyclical as a way of thinking through the issue, but ultimately decided that silence, or at least ambiguity, was the wiser course. Both interpretations are possible. The archive does not settle the question. What the archive also contains, and what has been less widely discussed, are financial records showing that the Vatican spent significant amounts of money during the war years on relief efforts. Funds sent to displaced persons. Funds sent to religious orders sheltering refugees. Funds sent to organizations working in ghettos and camps. The amounts are documented. The recipients are documented. The question of whether that money reached the people it was intended to reach is harder to determine. But the intent to provide material support is clear. That financial support is part of the record in a way that complicates the narrative of total silence. The Vatican was not doing nothing, it was doing something. The question is whether what it was doing was enough, and whether financial assistance without moral condemnation represents a coherent position or an evasion. There is also documentation of specific interventions. In cases where Vatican officials helped individuals escape. There is a file related to a group of Jews who were hidden in the Vatican itself and in properties controlled by the Church in Rome during the German occupation of the city in 1943 and 1944. The numbers vary depending on the source, but estimates suggest that several hundred people, possibly more, were sheltered in church properties in Rome during that period. Some of them survived because of that shelter. That is documented, that happened. But it happened quietly. It was not publicized at the time. It was not used as a basis for public statements about the Church's opposition to the persecution. It was simply done in a way that suggests the priority was practical rather than symbolic. Whether that was the right priority is again a question of values. One of the researchers who was granted access to the newly opened files in 2020 gave an interview a year later in which he was asked whether the documents had changed his understanding of Pius XII. He paused before answering. Then he said that what the documents had done was make him less certain. That before he read them, he had a position. He thought Pius had failed morally by not speaking out. But after reading the files, and after seeing the reports that came into the Vatican, and after seeing the internal discussions about what a public statement might or might not accomplish, he found it harder to say with confidence what Pius should have done. He did not say that Pius was right to stay silent. He said that the situation was more difficult than he had understood it to be from the outside. That is not absolution, but it is a kind of honesty that is worth paying attention to. There is another layer to this that the archive opening made visible, and it relates to what happened after the war. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, there were Nazi war criminals and collaborators who escaped Europe, many of them through routes that passed through Italy. Some of those escape routes, which became known collectively as ratlins, involved assistance from individuals within the Catholic Church, priests who provided false documents, monasteries that offered temporary shelter. Vatican officials warned some cases, helped arrange travel to South America. The extent of institutional Vatican involvement in those ratlins has been debated for decades. Some of it was clearly the work of individual clergy acting on their own initiative, sometimes out of misguided compassion, sometimes out of political sympathy with anti-communist figures regardless of their Nazi past. But there is also evidence, some of it in the newly opened files, that some Vatican officials knew what was happening and did not stop it. Whether that knowledge constituted approval, or whether it was simply a decision not to intervene in something that was seen as outside the Vatican's direct responsibility, it is unclear. What is clear is that people who had participated in atrocities were able to escape justice. And that, in some cases, people connected to the Church helped them do it. That sits very uncomfortably alongside the documentation of the Vatican helping Jewish refugees during the war. Both things happened, both are part of the record. And the tension between them has not been resolved by the opening of the archive. If anything, the opening has made the tension more visible. There was a moment during the initial review of the files when a researcher found a letter from a Jewish organization written in 1943, asking the Vatican to use its influence to stop deportations from a specific region. The letter was detailed. It named the region. It described what was happening. It asked for immediate intervention. There was a reply in the file, a formal A carefully worded reply expressing sympathy and noting that the Vatican was doing what it could through diplomatic channels. There was no documentation in the file showing that any diplomatic intervention actually occurred in that specific case. The researcher who found that exchange described it as one of the most difficult moments of his work in the archive. Not because it was shocking, but because it was ordinary. A request, a polite reply, and then nothing. That pattern appears multiple times in the files. Not every time. There are cases where intervention did happen, where the Vatican's diplomatic network was used, where lives were saved. But there are also cases where the request was acknowledged and filed and nothing more. The question of why some requests led to action and others did not is something the archive does not explain. It may be that the Vatican did not have influence in certain regions. It may be that some cases were deemed more urgent or more feasible. It may be that the decisions were made inconsistently by different people at different times without a clear overall policy. Or it may be that the requests were simply too many, and the capacity to respond was limited, and choices were made about which cases to prioritize in ways that now seem arbitrary or morally indefensible. All of those explanations are possible. None of them are comforting. What the archive opening has done more than anything else is shift the question. It is no longer a question of whether Pius XII knew what was happening. The documentation makes clear that he knew. Reports reached him, he read them. He was informed in detail about mass killings, deportations, Geta's camps. The question now is what he believed his responsibility was in the face of that knowledge, and whether the actions he took were consistent with the responsibility he claimed to hold as the moral leader of a global institution. That question does not have a simple answer, and the archive, even with millions of pages now accessible, does not provide one. What it provides is the record of decisions made in real time, under conditions of enormous pressure and uncertainty, by people who believed they were acting rightly and who may or may not have been correct in that belief. History will continue to judge those decisions. The archive simply holds them. Money has a way of complicating things that are supposed to be spiritual. The Vatican is a religious institution, but it is also a sovereign state. And like any sovereign state, it has expenses. It employs people, it maintains buildings. It funds missions and schools and hospitals around the world. It operates a diplomatic network, it publishes documents. It runs a postal service, a media operation, a library. Museums, all of that requires money. The institution responsible for managing much of that money is the Istituto per l'Opera di Religione, usually referred to by its Italian initials IOR in English. It translates roughly to the Institute for Works of Religion. Most people just call it the Vatican Bank, though technically it is not a bank in the commercial sense. It does not offer services to the general public. It exists primarily to manage the financial assets of the Vatican and of Catholic organizations around the world. It was founded in 1942 during the papacy of Pius XII. As a way to centralize and manage the Church's financial operations during a period when war had made international banking difficult. The intention was to create a secure institution that could handle the Church's money without relying on external banks that might be subject to political pressure or hostile governments. That intention was reasonable. The execution became more complicated for decades. The IOR operated with very little external oversight. It was not subject to Italian banking regulations because the Vatican is not part of Italy. It was not subject to international banking transparency requirements because for most of its existence, those requirements did not apply to sovereign states in the way they do now. It reported to the Pope and to the small number of officials within the Vatican who had oversight responsibility. What that meant in practice was that the IOR could handle money in ways that other banks could not. It could open accounts for individuals and organizations without the same disclosure requirements. It could move money across borders without the same scrutiny. It could maintain a level of privacy that was, by the standards of international finance, extremely unusual. That privacy was sometimes used for legitimate purposes. Religious orders operating in countries with hostile governments could keep funds secure. Missionaries could access money without attracting unwanted attention. The Church's global charitable work could be funded discreetly. But privacy of that kind also creates opportunities for other uses. And in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the IOR became entangled with an Italian bank called Banco Ambrosiano. And that entanglement ended with a scandal that reached into the highest levels of the Vatican and left a man dead under a bridge in London. Banco Ambrosiano was one of Italy's largest private banks. It was founded in 1896 and named after Saint Ambrose, the patron saint of Milan. It had a reputation as a Catholic bank, an institution aligned with the values of the Church. And for most of its history, that reputation was reasonably deserved. In 1975, a man named Roberto Calvi became chairman of Banco Ambrosiano. Calvi was ambitious, intelligent, and by most accounts increasingly reckless. Under his leadership, the bank expanded rapidly, opening branches and subsidiaries around the world. It loaned money to corporations, to governments, to investors. It became involved in complex financial arrangements that moved money between countries in ways that were difficult to trace. And it developed a close relationship with the IOR. The exact nature of that relationship has never been fully clarified. What is known is that the IOR held accounts at Banco Ambrosiano, that the IOR was listed as a shareholder in some of Ambrosiano's foreign subsidiaries. That money moved between the two institutions in ways that suggested coordination. And what is also known is that, by the early 1980s, Banco Ambrosiano was insolvent. The bank had made loans that were never going to be repaid. It had created shell companies in offshore jurisdictions to hide losses. It had misrepresented its financial position to regulators and investors. The structure Calvi had built was collapsing. And as it collapsed, questions began to be asked about where the money had gone and who had known what. In May of 1981, Calvi was arrested by Italian authorities and charged with currency violations. He was released on bail while awaiting trial. His position at the bank became increasingly unstable. Investigators were looking into Banco Ambrosiano's foreign subsidiaries, and what they were finding suggested fraud on a massive scale. Calvi began reaching out to contacts in the Vatican. He met with officials at the IOR. He reportedly asked for help, for documentation that would clarify the relationship between the two institutions, and for some kind of statement that would shield him or the bank from the worst of the legal consequences. What exactly he was told in those meetings is not part of the public record. What is part of the record is that on the 10th of June 1982, Calvi left Italy. He flew to Austria, then to London. He was traveling under a false passport. He met with various individuals whose identities have never been fully confirmed. He seemed to be looking for a way out, either financial or literal. On the morning of the 18th of June, 1982, the postal worker walking along the Thames in London noticed something hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge. It was Roberto Calvi. He was found suspended from scaffolding under the bridge, a rope around his neck. His pockets were filled with stones and cash, thousands of pounds in various currencies. His clothing was soaked. The initial assumption was suicide. A man facing financial ruin and criminal prosecution had killed himself in a foreign city. But the details did not fit cleanly. The scaffolding he was hanging from was difficult to reach. It would have required climbing down in the dark, over the edge of the bridge while carrying stones and money. Calvi was not a young man. He was 52, slightly built, not in particularly good physical condition. The idea that he had managed that climb, arranged the noose, and hanged himself seemed improbable to some of the investigators. There was also the symbolism, Blackfriars Bridge. Calvi's body was found hanging beneath a bridge named after an order of friars, in a city far from home, in a manner that seemed almost theatrical. A coroner's inquest initially ruled the death a suicide. 10 years after, additional investigation. That ruling was overturned. A second inquest in 1983 returned an open verdict, meaning the cause of death could not be determined then. In 2002, Italian authorities reopened the case and concluded that Calvi had been murdered. Several people were eventually charged in connection with his death, including members of the mafia and individuals connected to irregular Masonic lodges. The trial took place in Italy in 2007. All of the defendants were acquitted due to insufficient evidence. Roberto Calvi's death remains officially unsolved. The question of who killed Roberto Calvi if he was killed is one question, the question of why is another, and the question of what the Vatican knew and when it knew it is a third question that has never been satisfactorily answered. In the days following Calvi's death, Banco Ambrosiano collapsed completely. Italian regulators seized the bank. Investigators began untangling the network of shell companies and offshore accounts that Calvi had created. What they found was hundreds of millions of dollars in debt, much of it tied to loans that had been made to companies that existed only on paper. And many of those paper companies were connected to the IOR. The IOR had issued letters of patronage for some of Banco Ambrosiano's subsidiaries. Those letters were not formal guarantees, but they created the impression that the Vatican stood behind the companies in question. Investors and creditors had relied on that impression when making financial decisions. When the companies turned out to be empty, when the loans could not be repaid, the question became whether the IOR bore any responsibility for the losses. The Vatican's initial position was that it did not. The letters of patronage Vatican officials argued had been issued as a courtesy, not as a financial commitment. The IOR had not directly borrowed money or defaulted on any loans. It had simply provided documentation that others had misinterpreted or misused. That position was legally defensible, but it created a public relations problem. Because the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano had wiped out the savings of thousands of ordinary depositors, many of them Italian Catholics who had trusted the bank in part because of its association with the Church. The scandal deepened when investigators discovered that some of the money that had moved through Banco Ambrosiano and its subsidiaries appeared to have been connected to other activities. Payments to political organizations. Payments to groups involved in arms smuggling. Payments to individuals connected to organized crime. There were reports never fully substantiated that some of the money had been used to fund Solidarity, the anti-communist movement in Poland. During the early 1980s, the Vatican had reasons to support Solidarity. Pope John Paul II was Polish. The Church was deeply opposed to communist governments. Funding resistance movements in Eastern Europe would have been consistent with the Vatican's political and religious interests. But if that funding had been channeled through Banco Ambrosiano and disguised within the larger web of fraudulent transactions, it would mean that the Vatican had been complicit, even indirectly, in the structure that led to the bank's collapse. None of that has been proven. The documentation that exists is incomplete, and much of it is held in archives that remain restricted. Italian investigators requested access to IOR records as part of their investigation into Banco Ambrosiano. The Vatican declined to provide full access, citing its sovereignty and the confidentiality of its financial operations. In 1984, the Vatican agreed to a settlement. It did not admit faults, but it paid $241 million to Banco Ambrosiano's creditors as what was described as a voluntary contribution in recognition of moral involvement. Moral involvement is a phrase that does a lot of work. It acknowledges some level of connection without admitting legal responsibility. It allows the institution to make a payment that resolves the immediate crisis without creating a basis for further claims. It also does not explain what actually happened. The key figure within the IOR during this period was Archbishop Paul Marcinkus. He was an American originally from Illinois, and he had risen through the Vatican bureaucracy to become head of the IOR in 1971. He was close to Pope Paul VI and later to John Paul II. He was known for his financial acumen and for his ability to manage the Vatican's complex international operations. He was also the person most directly responsible for the IOR's relationship with Roberto Calvi and Banco Ambrosiano. After Calvi's death and the collapse of the bank, Marcinkus became the focus of intense scrutiny. Italian prosecutors wanted to question him. They wanted access to IOR records. They issued warrants. But Marcinkus remained within Vatican City, where Italian authorities had no jurisdiction. The Vatican refused to extradite him. It argued that he had committed no crime, that the IOR's involvement with Banco Ambrosiano had been legitimate, and that any suggestion otherwise was an attack on the sovereignty of the Holy See. Marcinkus was never charged. He remained head of the IOR until 1989. When he was quietly reassigned, he retired to Arizona, where he lived until his death in 2006. He gave very few interviews. In one of the few public statements he made, he said that he had done nothing wrong, that he had acted in the best interests of the Church, and that the scandal had been manufactured by people who wanted to damage the Vatican's reputation. He may have believed that, or he may have been following the institutional position because that was what his role required. What is clear is that he knew more about the relationship between the IOR and Banco Ambrosiano than he ever publicly disclosed. And what is also clear is that the documentation of that relationship, if it exists in complete form, is held in the Vatican's archives and has never been made fully accessible. There have been other financial scandals involving the IOR since the Banco Ambrosiano affair. Allegations of money laundering. Allegations of accounts being used to move money for individuals and organizations engaged in illegal activities. Allegations that the IOR's lack of transparency made it an attractive destination for funds that needed to be hidden from law enforcement. In response to those allegations, the Vatican has implemented reforms. In 2013, Pope Francis created a new financial oversight body and brought in external auditors. The IOR began complying with international banking transparency standards. Accounts that could not be properly documented were closed. The institution's operations were restructured to align more closely with the regulatory expectations of modern international finance. Those reforms were real. They represented a genuine shift in how the IOR operates. But they also implicitly acknowledged that the previous system had been inadequate, that the lack of oversight had created opportunities for misuse, and that the Vatican's financial operations had not always met the standards the institution publicly claimed to uphold. What the reforms did not do was open the archive to a full accounting of what happened during the decades when those standards were not in place. The records related to the IOR's operations in the 1970s and 1980s remain restricted. Researchers who have tried to access them have been told that they involve ongoing financial matters, or that they contain information related to living individuals, or that they fall under categories of documentation that are not part of the Apostolic Archive's mandate. All of those explanations may be accurate, but they also mean that the full story of what happened between the Vatican Bank and Banco Ambrosiano, of how much Vatican officials knew about Roberto Calvi's activities, and of whether the Church's money was used in ways that violated its own stated principles, is something that cannot be determined from outside the institution. Roberto Calvi's family spent years trying to get answers. They pursued legal cases. They hired investigators. They challenged the initial ruling of suicide and succeeded in having it overturned. But they never found out who killed him if he was killed, or why. One of Calvi's children said in an interview many years later that the hardest part was not knowing whether his father had been murdered or had taken his own life, not knowing whether the people he had trusted had betrayed him or tried to help him, not knowing whether the institution he had believed in, the Church he had seen as an ally, had been complicit in what happened to him or had simply been used. That uncertainty is the shape of what remains. The man found dead under a bridge, a bank that collapsed, millions of dollars that moved through accounts and disappeared, an institution that paid a settlement without admitting fault, and an archive that holds records of what happened, or at least some of what happened, in sections that are not open to the people who most want to read them. The question is not whether something wrong occurred. Even the Vatican's payment of $241 million suggests that something did. The question is what exactly occurred and who knew, and whether the decisions made during that period were consistent with the values the institution claims to represent. The archive could answer that question, or at least it could provide the documentation that would allow others to answer it. But it has not, and there is no indication that it will. There are some stories that begin with children, and those are often the hardest ones to think about clearly. Because children are not usually strategic. They do not typically have reasons to fabricate complex theological narratives. When a child says they saw something, the question is not usually whether they are lying in a calculated way. The question is what they actually saw, and what they understood it to be, and how the adults around them interpreted it afterward. In 1917, in a rural area of Portugal, near a town called Fatima, 3 children said they saw a woman. The children were Lucia dos Santos, 10, and her younger cousins Francisco and Jacinta Marto. Ages 9 and 7, they were shepherds, watching their family's sheep in a field called Cova de Iria. It was May 13th. They had seen a flash of light, which they first thought was lightning, though the sky was clear. Then they saw a figure they described as a lady dressed in white. Standing above a small oak tree, the lady spoke to them. She told them not to be afraid. She asked them to return to the same place on the 13th day of each month for the next 6 months. She said she would give them messages. She said she wanted them to pray, specifically to pray the rosary every day for peace. Because the First World War was still ongoing and much of Europe was being destroyed. The children went home and told their families what they had seen. The adults reacted the way adults generally react to children claiming visions. Some believed them, some dismissed it, some were angry, thinking the children were lying or had been influenced by something inappropriate. But the children insisted, and the following month, on June 13th, they went back to the field, and they said the lady appeared again. This continued monthly through October. By the later apparitions, word had spread. Crowds began gathering at Cova de Iria on the 13th of each month. Hundreds of people, then thousands. Most of them could not see or hear anything unusual. But they watched the children, who stood staring at a spot above the oak tree, speaking to someone the crowd could not perceive. The children said the lady gave them messages during these apparitions. Some of the messages were made public relatively soon afterward. The lady had identified herself according to the children as Our Lady of the Rosary. She had asked for a chapel to be built at the site. She had emphasized the importance of prayer and penance. She had also told the children 3 secrets. The first 2 secrets were eventually shared. The first was a vision of hell, described by the children as a terrifying experience that convinced them of the reality of damnation. The second was a prediction that the First World War would end, but that if people did not stop offending God, a worse war would begin during the next papacy. It also included a request that Russia be consecrated to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, with the promise that if this was done, Russia would convert and there would be peace. Both of those secrets were made public in the years following the apparitions. The second one in particular has been the subject of significant theological and political discussion, especially during the Cold War, when the idea of Russia's conversion had obvious geopolitical implications. But the third secret was not shared, according to Lucia, who was the only one of the 3 children to survive into adulthood. The lady told them a third thing on July 13, 1917. But they were instructed not to reveal it immediately. Lucia said she was told the secret could be made known eventually. But not yet. Francisco and Jacinta both died young, victims of the influenza pandemic that swept Europe in 1918 and 1919. Lucia became a nun. She lived a long life. dying in 2005 at the age of 97. And for most of that life-ish kept the third secret to herself, except that she eventually wrote it down in 1944. The Bishop of Laria, acting under instruction from the Vatican, asked Lucia to write out the third secret so that it could be preserved in case something happened to her. Lucia was reluctant. She later said that she struggled with whether to do it, that she felt uncertain about putting the secret into words. But eventually she did. She wrote it in a letter, sealed it in an envelope, and sent it to the bishop with instructions that it could be opened and read by the Cardinal Patriarch of Lisbon after 1960, or earlier if he deemed it necessary. The envelope was sent to Rome in 1957. It was placed in the Vatican's archives, and it was not opened in 1960. The decision not to open it, or not to reveal it if it was opened, caused immediate speculation. If the secret was supposed to be revealed in 1960, and the Vatican chose not to reveal it, that suggested the content was something the Church did not want made public. Theories proliferated. Some thought it predicted the end of the world. Some thought it predicted a nuclear war. Some thought it contained a warning about the Church itself, about apostasy or corruption within the hierarchy. The Vatican said nothing specific. A statement was issued saying that the secret would probably remain sealed forever, which only intensified the speculation. For more than 40 years, the Third Secret of Fatima remained one of the most discussed unreleased documents in the Vatican's possession. It became a point of reference for people who believed the Church was hiding something. It was cited in apocalyptic literature, in conspiracy theories, in theological debates about the end times. And then, in the year 2000, the Vatican released it. The announcement came on May 13th, the anniversary of the first apparition. A ceremony was held at Fatima. Pope John Paul II was present. Cardinal Angelo Sodanoth, Vatican Secretary of State, gave a speech in which he described the content of the Third Secret before the text itself was made public. According to Sodano, the secret was a vision. Lucia had written that she saw a bishop dressed in white, who the children understood to be the Pope, walking through a ruined city filled with corpses. The bishop was climbing a mountain, and at the top he was killed by soldiers who shot him with bullets and arrows. Other bishops, priests, and laypeople were also killed in the vision. The text of Lucia's letter was published a few weeks later. It matched what Sodano had described. It was a symbolic, apocalyptic vision written in language that was poetic and not entirely clear in its specifics. The Vatican's interpretation, presented by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict XVI, was that the vision referred to the assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II in 1981. John Paul had been shot in St. Peter's Square on May 13th, the anniversary of the first Fatima apparition. He survived. and he later attributed his survival to the intervention of Our Lady of Fatima. A bullet removed from his body was placed in the crown of a statue of Mary at the Fatima shrine. That interpretation was presented as the official position. The third secret had been a prophetic vision of an attack on the Pope. The attack had occurred, the Pope had survived. The secret had been fulfilled. The response from those who had been waiting for the revelation was mixed. Some accepted the interpretation. It made sense within the context of John Paul's papacy and his personal devotion to Fatima. The timing aligned, the symbolism fit. But others felt that the released text did not match what they had expected or what they believed Lucia had said in other contexts. There were reports never fully confirmed that Lucia had told visitors over the years that the third secret concerned a crisis of faith within the Church, that it involved apostasy among clergy, that it predicted a time when the faithful would be confused and the Church's leadership would fail to provide clarity. None of that was in the text that was released. The question of whether the released text was complete became the new question almost immediately. There were reasons to wonder. The text that was published was short. It was a vision, written in symbolic language, without extended commentary or explanation. It did not include words spoken by the lady, which the first two secrets had. It was purely visual. A description of what Lucia said she had seen. Some people who had studied Fatima closely pointed out that Lucia had said, in earlier interviews and letters, that the third secret included words, that the lady had explained the vision, had said something about what it meant or what was being asked. But the text released in 2000 contained no such explanation. It was just the vision itself. Cardinal Ratzinger addressed this in the theological commentary he wrote to accompany the release. He acknowledged that some people had expected more. He said that the vision was complete as written, that it was the entirety of what Lucia had recorded in 1944. He suggested that any additional context or interpretation Lucia might have provided in later years was her own reflection, not part of the original secret. That explanation is plausible. Lucia lived for decades after writing the secret down. She spoke about Fatima many times. It is possible that she elaborated on the vision, added her own understanding of what it meant, and that those elaborations became conflated in people's minds with the original text. But it is also possible that there was more to what she wrote, and that the Vatican chose to release only part of it. There is no way to verify which is true without access to the original envelope and whatever documentation exists around it. Whether Lucia wrote one letter or multiple letters, whether the envelope contained only the vision or also included commentary, whether the text published in 2000 is the complete content of what was sent to Rome in 1957. Those questions cannot be answered from outside the archive. What can be said is that Lucia herself, in the years after the release, gave statements that were carefully worded but did not entirely dispel the uncertainty. She confirmed that the vision had been published. She said that the interpretation offered by the Vatican was acceptable. But when asked directly whether everything had been revealed, her answers were less definitive. Now, she spoke about the secret in ways that suggested there were layers to it, dimensions that could not be fully captured in a single text. She died in 2005, and with her death, the possibility of clarification from the only living witness ended. There is a broader context worth considering here, which is the way the Vatican has historically handled Marian apparitions. The Church is cautious about claims of visions and miracles. It has a formal process for investigating them. A bishop can open an inquiry. Witnesses are questioned. Medical and psychological evaluations are conducted. Theologians review the content of the messages to ensure they align with church teaching. The process can take years, sometimes decades. Most reported apparitions are not approved. The Church's position is usually that there is insufficient evidence, or that the content is theologically problematic, or that the witnesses are unreliable. Approval is rare and comes with careful qualifications. The Church does not say that the apparition definitely occurred. It says that the messages are consistent with Catholic doctrine and that devotion to the site is permissible. Fatima was approved in 1930, 13 years after the apparitions. The approval was based on the consistency of the children's accounts, the large number of witnesses to unusual events at the site, particularly a solar phenomenon reported by thousands of people on October 13, 1917, and the theological acceptability of the messages. But approval does not mean the Church commits to every detail of what the visionaries reported. It means the apparition is recognized as worthy of belief, not that every element of it is doctrinally binding. That distinction matters when thinking about the Third Secret. The Vatican's release of the text and its interpretation of the vision as referring to the 1981 assassination attempt represents the Church's official position. But it does not necessarily represent the entirety of what Lucia believed or experienced. And it does not foreclose the possibility that there are aspects of the secret that were considered too sensitive, too ambiguous, or too potentially divisive to release. There are people within certain Catholic communities, particularly those who identify as traditionalist, who believe the Third Secret predicted the crisis in the Church that followed the Second Vatican Council. Vatican I, which took place from 1962 to 1965. Introduced significant changes to Catholic liturgy and practice. Those changes were welcomed by many Catholics, but were deeply troubling to others, who saw them as a departure from tradition. In the decades following the Council, there were disputes about doctrine, and about the role of the laity, about the liturgies, about the Church's engagement with the modern world. Some Catholics left the Church. Some formed breakaway communities. The sense of crisis was real, even if interpretations of what caused it varied widely. If the Third Secret contained a prediction of internal division within the Church, of a loss of faith among clergy, of confusion and conflict over doctrine, that would explain why the Vatican might have been reluctant to release it. It would be a message that questioned the direction the Church was taking. And institutions generally do not publicize criticisms of themselves, especially when those criticisms claim divine origin. There is no proof that this is what the secret contained. But the speculation persists because the released text does not feel complete to many people who have studied Fatima. It feels like part of an answer, not the whole answer. In 2016, Pope Francis visited Fatima. During that visit, he was asked by a journalist whether there were additional parts of the Fatima secret that had not been revealed. Francis smiled and said that there was no secret within the secret, that everything had been published. But he said it in a tone that some interpreted as dismissive of the speculation, and others interpreted as subtly evasive. A tone is difficult to assess, especially from a brief interaction reported secondhand. What is easier to assess is the structure of what was released. A vision without explanation. A symbolic narrative open to interpretation. An official reading that closes the question by tying it to a specific historical event, but in a way that does not preclude other readings. That is a pattern that appears elsewhere in how the Vatican handles sensitive revelations. Release enough to satisfy the immediate question. Frame it in a way that supports the institution's interests. Leave ambiguities unresolved, but not so glaring that they demand further inquiry. It is a careful approach. It manages expectations without committing to a position that might later be challenged. And it works in the sense that the Third Secret is now considered officially revealed. The speculation has diminished, and the matter is largely settled in the public mind. But for those who look closely, the questions remain. Is the text published in 2000 the complete content of what Lucia wrote in 1944? Or was there more held back because it was deemed unsuitable for release? If there was more, where is it now? Is it still in the archive, filed separately? Or was it destroyed and considered too problematic to preserve? Did Lucia write only once about the secret? Or did she write multiple times, and if so, are all of those writings accounted for in what was released? Those questions do not have public answers. They may have answers somewhere in the Vatican's records, or they may not. It is possible that the full story of what Lucia wrote, what she believed, and what instructions she gave about the timing and manner of revelation is documented in files that have never been opened. It is also possible that the released text is genuinely everything, and that the sense of incompleteness is just the result of decades of speculation, creating expectations that no single document could meet. Both are possible. The archive holds whatever is true, and it has not clarified which. Is the Bible that most people know. The collection of books that appears in hotel rooms and on shelves in churches and in the hands of witnesses taking oaths in courtrooms. is not the only version that has ever existed. That statement is not controversial among historians or theologians. It is simply a fact. The process by which certain texts were included in the Christian canon and others were excluded took centuries. It was not a single decision made at a single moment. It was a gradual process of discernment debate, a political negotiation, and eventually formal declarations by church councils. But the texts that were excluded did not all disappear. Some of them survived. Some were copied and preserved in monasteries. Some were buried and forgotten and then rediscovered centuries later. Some are held in libraries and museums. And some are held in the Vatican's collections, in sections that are accessible to a very small number of scholars under very specific conditions. The question of why those texts were excluded is complex. Some were excluded because they were written later than the others, in periods when the apostolic connection was less clear. Some were excluded because their theology did not align with what became Orthodox Christian teaching. Some were excluded because they were associated with groups that the early church considered heretical. And some were excluded for reasons that are less clear. Because the documentation of the decision-making process is incomplete, and because the people who made those decisions did not always write down their reasoning in ways that survived. What matters for tonight is not whether the excluded texts should have been included. That is a theological question. And this is not a theological script. What matters is that those texts exist, that some of them are in the Vatican's possession, and that access to them has been restricted in ways that raise questions about what the institution believes those texts might reveal. One of the most discussed categories of excluded texts is the Gnostic Gospels. Gnosticism was a broad and somewhat diverse set of beliefs that existed in the early centuries of Christianity. It emphasized secret knowledge, the idea that salvation came through understanding hidden truths rather than through faith and works alone. It often included a dualistic cosmology, the idea that the material world was created by a lesser divine being and that the true God was distant and unknowable except through gnosis, or knowledge. The early church rejected Gnosticism. It was declared heretical at multiple councils. The theological reasons were significant. Gnostic beliefs contradicted core Christian teachings about the goodness of creation, the incarnation of Christ, and the accessibility of salvation to all people, not just those who possessed secret knowledge. But the rejection of Gnosticism as a theology did not immediately result in the destruction of all Gnostic texts. Some were kept studied, refuted in writing by early church fathers. Some were preserved as examples of what the church opposed. And some, it seems, were simply filed away in 1945. A collection of Gnostic texts was discovered in Egypt, near a town called Nag Hammadi. The texts had been buried in a jar, possibly hidden by monks who wanted to preserve them despite official prohibitions. The collection included Gospels attributed to Thomas, Philip and Mary Magdalene among others. These texts had been lost for more than 1,000 years. Their rediscovery was one of the most significant manuscript finds of the 20th century. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, contains sayings attributed to Jesus, some of which are similar to sayings in the canonical Gospels and some of which are not. It does not include a narrative of Jesus' birth ministry, a crucifixion or resurrection. It is just a collection of teachings. Some of those teachings align with the Jesus of the canonical Gospels. Some suggest a more Gnostic interpretation, emphasizing hidden knowledge and inner enlightenment. The existence of texts like the Gospel of Thomas raises a question. If these texts were in circulation in the early Christian communities, if people were reading them and treating them as sacred, why were they excluded from the canon while others were included? The usual answer is that they were excluded because they were not apostolic, meaning they were not written by apostles or by people directly connected to the apostles. The canonical Gospels Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were understood to have been written either by apostles or by close associates of apostles, and to reflect the earliest and most reliable traditions about Jesus. The Gnostic texts, by contrast, were seen as later compositions, written by people who were promoting a particular theological agenda that diverged from the apostolic teaching. That explanation is historically defensible. The dating of the text's theological content, the lack of clear apostolic authorship, all of those are legitimate reasons for exclusion. But it is also true that the decision about what was apostolic and what was not was made by people who had theological and political reasons to favor certain texts over others. The early church was not a neutral arbiter. It was an institution trying to define itself, to establish orthodoxy, to distinguish true teaching from false teaching. The texts that were included in the canon were the ones that supported the version of Christianity that won the theological debates of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. The texts that were excluded were the ones that did not. That does not mean the excluded texts are more authentic or more true. It just means that the canon is the result of a process that was shaped by human decisions, not handed down complete from the beginning. And some of the texts that were part of that process, some of the Gospels and letters and apocalypses that were read and discussed and eventually rejected, are now in the Vatican's manuscript collections. Not all of them, some are in other libraries in universities, in national archives, but the Vatican holds some, particularly texts that were confiscated during the medieval period from groups that the Church considered heretical, or texts that were donated or acquired over centuries of accumulation. Access to those texts is limited. Researchers can request to see them, but the process is restrictive. You have to demonstrate a legitimate scholarly purpose. You have to provide credentials. You have to explain what you are looking for and why. And even then, access is not guaranteed. Some scholars who have been granted access have described what they found. Manuscripts of apocryphal Gospels, Texts that circulated in the early church but were never included in the canon. Some of those texts are known from other sources. The Gospel of Peter, for example, fragments of which were found in Egypt and which is also referenced in the Vatican's collections. The Protvangelium of James, then account of the early life of Mary, which was widely read in the medieval period but never canonized. But there are also references in catalogs and inventories to texts that are less well known. Manuscripts whose content has not been fully published, whose existence is acknowledged but whose details remain unclear. Why those texts have not been published is a question that does not have a single answer. In some cases, the texts may be fragmentary, too damaged to produce a reliable edition. In some cases, they may be duplicates of texts that are already known from other manuscripts. In some cases, the content may be considered theologically unimportant or academically uninteresting. And in some cases, the content may be sensitive. There is a specific category of early Christian texts that complicates the narrative the Church has traditionally told about itself. Texts that suggest the early Christian communities were more diverse in their beliefs and practices than later orthodoxy allowed for. Texts that describe Jesus in ways that do not align neatly with the Christology that was eventually declared official. Texts that give prominence to figures the canonical tradition marginalized. One example is the various texts associated with Mary Magdalene. The canonical Gospels mention Mary Magdalene as a follower of Jesus, as a witness to the crucifixion, and as the first person to see Jesus after the resurrection. But her role in those texts is limited. She speaks briefly. She is named but not developed as a character in the way the male disciples are. But in some of the non-canonical texts, Mary Magdalene appears as a more central figure. The Gospel of Mary, part of which was found in the Nag Hammadi collection, portrays her as a disciple who received special teaching from Jesus, teaching that the other disciples did not fully understand. In that text, Peter questions whether Jesus would really have spoken to a woman privately, sharing knowledge he did not share with the men. Mary responds with authority, and the text suggests that her understanding of Jesus' message was deeper than that of the other disciples. The Gospel of Philippanother text from the same collection contains a passage that describes Jesus as having a close relationship with Mary Magdalene, and closer than his relationship with the other disciples. The passage has been interpreted in various ways, some arguing it suggests a romantic or marital relationship, others arguing it is symbolic of spiritual intimacy. The Church has historically rejected these texts as late, as Gnosticas theologically unreliable, and there are legitimate historical reasons for that rejection. The texts were written later than the canonical Gospels. They reflect theological ideas that developed in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Not in the first, they are not eyewitness accounts. But their existence complicates the simple narrative that the early Church spoke with one voice about who Jesus was and what his message meant. They suggest that there were competing interpretations, competing traditions, and that the version that became orthodox was the version that had institutional power, not necessarily the version that was historically earliest or most accurate. The Vatican's position has always been that the canonical texts are the ones that reflect authentic apostolic teaching, that the process of discernment that led to the canon was guided by the Holy Spirit, and that the texts that were excluded rightly. That is a theological claim. It requires faith in the Church's authority to make such determinations. For those who hold that faith, the question is settled. But for historians, for scholars who approach these texts as historical documents rather than as sacred scripture, the question is more open. And the fact that some of these texts remain in restricted collections, accessible only to a small number of people under controlled conditions, creates the appearance that the Church is still guarding against interpretations it finds threatening. There is another dimension to this that has to do with how the canon itself was established. The list of books that would be considered scripture was not formalized until relatively late. The earliest known list that matches the current New Testament canon comes from a letter written by Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, 367 AD. That is more than 3 centuries after Jesus' death. Before that, different Christian communities used different collections of texts. Some included books that others did not. Some excluded books that others considered essential. The process of reaching consensus took time and involved significant disagreement. There were texts that were widely used but whose canonical status was disputed. The Book of Revelation, for example, was accepted in some regions and rejected in others. The letter to the Hebrews was considered Pauline by some and not by others. The letter of James was questioned because it seemed to contradict Paul's teaching on faith and works. Eventually, church councils made formal decisions. The Council of Carthage in 397 AD produced a list of canonical books that closely matches what is now the Catholic and Orthodox canon. But even after those decisions, debate continued in some quarters. The Reformation brought new disagreements, with Protestants removing books from the Old Testament that Catholics and Orthodox still consider canonical. The point is that the canon was not handed down complete. It was constructed over time, through a process that involved theological debate, political negotiation, and institutional authority. And the texts that were excluded during that process did not all vanish. Some were preserved intentionally or otherwise, and some of them are now in the Vatican's collections. Researchers who study the formation of the canon would benefit enormously from access to those texts, not because the texts would overturn the canon, but because they would provide insight into the process by which certain texts were chosen and others were set aside. They would illuminate the diversity of early Christian thought. They would help clarify what the early church considered important and what it considered dangerous. But that access is limited, and the limitation creates the impression whether accurate or not, that the Church is still trying to control the narrative about its own origins. There is a specific manuscript that has been the subject of significant speculation among scholars of early Christianity. It is referenced in a Vatican catalogue from the 18th century as a codex containing fragments of a gospel not identified by name. The catalogue entry is brief. It notes the manuscript's location, its approximate age, and the fact that it contains material not found in the canonical Gospels. But there is no published edition of the text. There is no detailed description of its content. Scholars who have requested access to it have been told that it is too fragile to be handled, or that it is undergoing conservation, or that it falls under a category of material that is not currently available for consultation. Those explanations may be entirely accurate. Old manuscripts are fragile. Conservation takes time. Not everything in an archive can be made available immediately. But the manuscript has been in the Vatican's possession for centuries. And the fact that it has never been published, that its content remains undescribed in any detailed scholarly work, raises questions. Is it genuinely too fragile to photograph or digitize? Or is its content considered problematic? Does it contain theological ideas that would challenge orthodox teaching? Or is it simply another apocryphal text of the kind that are already known and that do not add anything significant to existing knowledge? Without access, those questions cannot be answered. And the scholars who would be most equipped to answer them are the ones who are not being allowed to see the manuscript. There is a broader issue here that goes beyond individual texts. It is the question of who gets to decide what is historically important and what can be safely ignored. For centuries, the Church made that decision unilaterally. It determined what was canonical and what was apocryphal. It decided which texts would be copied and preserved, and which would be allowed to deteriorate or be destroyed. It controlled access to the manuscripts it held, granting it selectively to scholars who could be trusted not to use the material in ways that would damage the Church's reputation or authority. That control has loosened over time. The archive is more open now than it was a century ago. The scholars from secular institutions can access materials that were once restricted to Catholic clergy. And texts that were hidden or forgotten have been rediscovered and published. But the control has not disappeared entirely. There are still categories of material that are off limits. There are still manuscripts that are referenced but not accessible. There are still decisions being made within the institution about what can be shared and what cannot. And those decisions are not neutral. They are shaped by the Church's understanding of its own interests, its theological commitments, its concern for how it is perceived by the outside world. That is understandable. Every institution protects itself. Every archive makes decisions about access based on sensitivity, fragility concerns, and other factors. But when the institution in question is one that claims to be the guardian of truth, when it presents itself as the authoritative interpreter of sacred history. The fact that it continues to restrict access to documents that might complicate that interpretation is more than an archival policy. It is a statement about what the institution believes can be safely known, and what it believes should remain hidden. The excluded Gospels, apocryphal texts, the fragments and codices that sit in climate-controlled storage beneath the Vatican, are not going to overturn Christianity. They are not going to prove that the canonical Gospels are false or that the Church's theological foundations are illegitimate. But they might show that the early Church was more diverse, more uncertain, more human in its decision-making than the official story suggests. They might show that the process of defining orthodoxy involved excluding voices that had legitimate claims to authenticity. They might show that the Biblia as it exists now is the product of choices made by people who had reasons. Good reasons in many cases, but still human reasons, for including some texts and excluding others. And that knowledge, that awareness of the constructed nature of the canon, is something the institution has historically been reluctant to encourage. The texts are there in the archive, on the shelves, in the catalogs, and most of them will never be read by anyone outside the institution that holds them. There is a room in Rome where letters arrive that most people would not know how to write. They are not addressed to a parish priest, not usually. They are addressed to the Vatican, to an office that, for centuries, has been responsible for deciding what is acceptable belief and what is not. What is genuine spiritual crisis and what is something else entirely. The office is now called the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. For most of its history, it was known as the Holy Office. And before Thottas we have already discussed. It was the Roman Inquisition. Names change. Responsibilities shift slightly. But the central function remains the same, to guard doctrine. And among the categories of cases that have passed through that office are reports of possession. The Catholic Church still formally recognizes the possibility of demonic possession. That statement alone makes some people uncomfortable. But it is true. The Church distinguishes between mental illness and possession, and it requires medical and psychological evaluation before an exorcism is authorized. The rite of exorcism itself was revised in 1999, modernized in language but not eliminated. There are priests who are officially appointed as exorcists in dioceses around the world. They are not freelance. They operate with the permission of their bishop. And in complicated cases, documentation is sent to Rome. Those documents are part of the archive. What do they contain? That question is difficult to answer because access to them is extremely limited. Journalists have occasionally interviewed priests who have served as exorcists. Some of those priests have described writing reports, sending case summaries to the Vatican when something did not fit established patterns. They describe a process that is more bureaucratic than cinematic. Forms evaluations, correspondence about whether a particular manifestation qualifies as possession under canonical definitions. But the full case files, detailed reports, the transcripts of what was said during rituals, those are not public. The Church's position is that these records involve sensitive pastoral matters. They involve individuals who are often in psychological distress. Releasing such records would violate privacy and potentially cause harm. That reasoning is understandable. But there is another layer to the exorcism files that is less discussed: the theological implications. In 1973, the film The Exorcist was released. It was based loosely on a 1949 case in the United States involving a boy whose family sought help from Catholic priests. The case was documented by one of the priests involved, and elements of that documentation became the basis for the novel and film. The Church's response to the film was cautious. It did not endorse it. It did not condemn it outright. It reaffirmed that possession was rare, and that most cases presented as possession were psychological in origin. Behind that public caution was a private concern: how to maintain credibility in a modern world that increasingly interpreted spiritual phenomena in psychological or neurological terms. The exorcism files reflect that tension. In the 20th century, particularly after the Second Vatican Council, the Church placed greater emphasis on distinguishing between mental illness and possession. Exorcists were instructed to consult medical professionals. Bishops were told to be cautious about granting permission for the rite. The number of officially sanctioned exorcisms declined in some regions. But in other regions, particularly parts of Africa, Latin America, and even Italy, requests for exorcism increased. The Vatican found itself in a position where it had to balance two realities. On one hand, it could not deny the existence of possession without contradicting centuries of teaching and liturgical practice. On the other hand, it could not appear to endorse interpretations of mental illness that would undermine its relationship with modern medicine and science. The internal correspondence related to this balancing act is part of the archive of the Doctrine Office. In 1985, then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who was head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith before becoming Pope Benedict XVI, issued guidelines reminding bishops that exorcism should not be performed without explicit permission, and that discernment must involve medical expertise. Those guidelines exist publicly. What does not exist publicly are the case discussions that prompted them. There are reports from priests who have spoken carefully about their experience of cases that were escalated to Rome because they did not fit established patterns. Cases where the individual spoke languages they had not studied. Cases involving knowledge of hidden information. Cases that continued despite medical intervention. Are those reports accurate? Possibly. But without access to the documentation, they remain anecdotes. There is one particularly well-documented case from 1928 in Erling, involving a woman named Emma Schmidt, sometimes referred to by the pseudonym Anna Eklund. The case lasted for months. Multiple priests were involved. Detailed notes were taken. Those notes describe phenomena that, if taken at face value, are difficult to explain psychologically: aversion to sacred objects, physical strength beyond normal capacity, vocalizations in unfamiliar languages. Those notes are not in the Vatican archive. They are held elsewhere, but similar cases, and especially those referred upward for doctrinal clarification, would have produced documentation that now resides in Rome. What interests researchers is not whether possession is real. That is a matter of belief. What interests them is how the Church categorizes and interprets these cases internally, how it decides what qualifies as possession, what criteria are applied, how often Rome overrules local bishops, whether there have been cases where the doctrine office quietly concluded that a supposed possession was actually fraud or mental illness, and suppressed that conclusion to avoid scandal. There is also the historical dimension. During the early modern periods, accusations of possession were sometimes linked to accusations of witchcraft or heresy. The Inquisition handled such cases. The records of those trials are in the archives we discussed earlier. They show a complex picture. Some cases were dismissed. Some resulted in punishment. Some reveal that the Church was more skeptical than secular authorities in attributing phenomena to demonic causes. That historical skepticism complicates the stereotype of the Church as eager to see demons everywhere. But what about more recent cases in the 20th century? In the 21st, in 2014, Pope Francis spoke publicly about the reality of the devil in a way that surprised some observers. He emphasized that evil is not merely symbolic, that it is personal around the same time. The Vatican formally recognized the International Association of Exorcists, giving it canonical status. Those actions suggest that the Church has not moved away from belief in possession. If anything, it has reasserted it, which makes the exorcism files more interesting, not less. They are not relics of medieval superstition. They are contemporary documents, and they are sealed. There is a difference between believing something is possible and documenting that it has happened. The Church's official position is careful. Possession is rare. Most cases that appear to be possession are psychological or medical in nature. Exorcism is a sacramental, not a sacrament. It is a prayer of the Church, not a magical act. And it must never replace medical treatment. That is the public framework, but inside the documentation. In the reports sent to Rome, the tone is likely different. More specific, less general. Because Rome does not deal in abstractions when it reviews a case. It deals in details. What were the symptoms? How long did they last? What medical evaluations were conducted? Were there witnesses? Were there recordings? Did the subject respond to the rite in a way that fits established precedent? Those are administrative questions, not cinematic ones. Not dramatic, just procedural. And procedure is where institutions reveal what they actually believe. If the doctrine office consistently attributes unusual cases to mental illness, even when local priests suspect something supernatural, that would suggest skepticism at the highest levels. If, on the other hand, Rome affirms certain cases as authentic possession and authorizes extended rites, that would suggest something else entirely. We do not know which pattern dominates. There have been hints in interviews. Father Gabriel Amorths, who served as the chief exorcist of Rome for many years until his death in 2016, and claimed that he performed tens of thousands of exorcisms. That number has been debated. Critics say he counted minor prayers as exorcisms. Supporters say he was overwhelmed with requests and worked constantly. Lamorth also claimed that some cases were referred upward. That Rome was aware of specific instances where phenomena defied medical explanation. He never provided documentation. He could not. He was bound by confidentiality. But his statements suggest that the Doctrine Office does not treat every report as delusion. There is also the question of internal disagreement. The Church is not monolithic in its thinking. There are theologians who interpret possession language symbolically, as a way of describing profound psychological fragmentation or trauma. There are others who insist on a literal understanding. Those disagreements exist quietly within Catholic academic circles. Do those disagreements appear in internal memos? Are there letters in the archive where one theologian argues that a case should be understood neurologically, and another argues that it meets the criteria for possession? It would be surprising if those debates did not exist on paper somewhere. And if they do exist, they would reveal something important. Not about demons necessarily, but about how a modern institution negotiates belief in the supernatural within a scientific age. There is another dimension to these files that is less theological and more sociological. Patterns. If researchers had access to a large sample of exorcism case reports, they could analyze patterns across geography and time. Are cases more frequently reported in certain cultures, during certain political conditions, during periods of social stress? Anthropologists have long observed that manifestations labeled as possession often occur in contexts where individuals lack other forms of agency, where psychological distress has no socially acceptable outlet, where trauma cannot be spoken directly. If the Vatican's own files show similar clustering, that would support a psychological interpretation. If, however, the files show something else, cases that do not align with cultural expectation, cases that involve consistent patterns across continents and languages, that would complicate the analysis. But those patterns remain invisible because the data is not available. There was a moment in 1999 when the rite of exorcism was revised. That offered a glimpse of internal thinking. The updated rite emphasized the need for medical evaluation. It softened some of the older language. It clarified that the priest must not assume possession without clear signs. But it did not eliminate references to demons. The revision was a balance, modernization without denial. That balance suggests something about what the internal discussions may have been like. Some arguing that the language needed updating to avoid embarrassment. Others insisting that the reality behind the language must remain intact. In 2018, the course on exorcism was offered at a Vatican-affiliated university in Rome. It was framed as an academic seminar, open to clergy and lay people. Psychologists participated, so did theologians. The stated goal was to educate participants on how to distinguish between mental illness and spiritual phenomena. The fact that such a course exists publicly suggests that the internal files must be substantial. You do not develop training programs without case material. You do not refine criteria without reviewing examples. Some of those examples must have been drawn from real cases sent to Rome. And yet, none of those files are open to independent review. Confidentiality explains part of that. These involve living people, privacy matters. But archives have ways of anonymizing sensitive material. Governments release redacted intelligence files decades later. Medical records are used in research with identifying information removed. The Vatican has not chosen that path with exorcism cases, which leaves an unusual situation. An institution that publicly affirms the continued possibility of demonic possession. An office that privately receives and evaluates reports of it. A global network of clergy trained to recognize and respond to it. And a complete absence of accessible documentation for scholars who might study how those determinations are made. That absence creates a vacuum. And vacuums tend to fill themselves with speculation. Some imagine that the files contain undeniable evidence of supernatural phenomena, transcripts that would shock the modern world. Others imagine that the files reveal the opposite, that Rome quietly dismisses nearly all cases as psychological, but maintains public belief for pastoral reasons. Both imaginations cannot be correct. But without access, neither can be tested. There is something quietly consistent about this pattern across the archive as a whole. When the Church believes a document strengthens its moral authority, it eventually releases it. When a document complicates that authority, access slows, or narrows, or becomes conditional. That does not mean the Church is hiding something dramatic in the exorcism files. It may simply be protecting individuals and preserving dignity. But it also means that the public understanding of how the Church navigates belief in evil, literal evil, is shaped almost entirely by official statements, not by primary evidence. And the primary evidence is somewhere in Rome, filed, cataloged, stored at a stable temperature, unread by anyone who is not already inside, which is, in its own quiet way, a kind of mystery, not loud, not cinematic, just unanswered. If you stand very still in a large archive, there is a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of weight. A paper has weight even when it is thin. Even when it has been flattened and pressed and filed into boxes and stacked onto shelves. Multiply a single sheet by millions. Multiply that by centuries. The result is not just storage. It is accumulation. The Vatican Apostolic Archive holds accumulation, not only of documents, but of decisions, of interpretations, of moments when someone in authority chose one path over another and wrote it down. And because it was written down, it became part of the record. And because it became part of the record, it became part of history, we have walked slowly along the edges of that accumulation. The Inquisition files that reveal both cruelty and procedure. The Chinon parchment that slept for 700 years in the wrong folder. The letters from monarchs and prisoners and bankers. The wartime correspondence that shows knowledge without clarity. The financial records that hint at entanglements never fully explained. The sealed vision of Fatima. The manuscripts that trace the boundaries of Scripture. The case reports that sit between psychology and theology. Each of these is real, documented, grounded in events that occurred. And each of them shares a pattern, partial access, a selective release, careful framing. It would be easy at this point to slip into accusation, to say that secrecy implies guilt, that restricted files must contain scandal, that what has not been revealed is more important than what has. But archives do not work that way. Sometimes what remains sealed is mundane. Sometimes it is repetitive. Sometimes it is simply administratively sensitive and not historically explosive. And sometimes lies. What remains sealed would complicate the story an institution tells about itself. The Vatican is not unique in that regard. Governments classify documents. Corporations seal internal memos. Universities restrict access to personnel files. Institutions protect themselves. What makes the Vatican different is duration. Most institutions have existed for a few centuries at most. The Vatican's central authority has operated continuously for nearly 2 millennia. That continuity means its archive does not just hold secrets from one era. It holds overlapping layers of them. A medieval dispute filed next to a Renaissance treaty. A 19th century theological memorandum stored meters away from a 20th century diplomatic cable. A sealed envelope from 1944 resting in the same climate-controlled corridor as a parchment from 1308. The weight of that continuity changes how secrecy functions. Because when secrecy persists across centuries, it becomes less about any single document and more about institutional memory itself. What does the Vatican remember that the rest of the world has forgotten? That question is not theatrical, it is practical. The Vatican has maintained diplomatic relations with nations that no longer exist. It has corresponded with monarchies that collapsed, with revolutionary movements that succeeded, with regimes that committed atrocities and then rewrote their own histories. In many cases, the Vatican's archive holds copies of communications that were destroyed elsewhere, which means there are events for which the Vatican may possess the only surviving primary record. That possibility is rarely discussed. The focus is usually on what the Vatican might be hiding about itself. But there is another angle. What might it know about everyone else? During wars, diplomats report candidly. During crises, leaders confide in religious authorities in ways they would not confide publicly. During negotiations, proposals are floated privately that never reach official channels. Those conversations are sometimes preserved. And if they are preserved in Rome. Not all of them, not exclusively, but some. That reality complicates the idea of the archive as merely defensive. It is not only a vault protecting the Church's reputation. It is also a reservoir of external history. And that reservoir is controlled by one institution. There is something almost paradoxical about that. An archive exists to preserve truth. But control of an archive allows control of which truths are visible. The Vatican has in recent decades opened more than it once did. And scholars can request access to periods that were previously sealed. Collections once considered untouchable are now partially available. But openness in phases still means control in phases. And control shapes narrative. When the Chinon parchment was found, it shifted the story of the Templars slightly. Not dramatically. Not enough to overturn centuries of scholarship, but enough to soften the idea that the papacy had condemned them outright. When the Pew's XII files opened, they complicated both the harshest criticisms and the most generous defenses. They made certainty harder. What might future openings do? That question is not rhetorical. There are collections in the archive that have not yet reached the time threshold for release. Diplomatic correspondence from the later 20th century. Internal memoranda from periods of social upheaval. Files related to church responses to abuse scandals. Some of which are still restricted. Those documents will eventually become historical rather than contemporary. And when they do, the archive will face the same decision it has faced before. Release fully, release partially, or delay. Every choice will shape understanding. There is a phrase sometimes used by archivists, the silence of the archive. It refers to what is missing, not only what was destroyed, but what was never written down. What was discussed orally and never recorded. What was intentionally excluded from the file. The Vatican's silence is not only in sealed boxes. It is in decisions never documented. In meetings without minutes. In conversations that ended without paper. No archive can capture everything. But this one captures more than most. Which means its silences matter more. It is possible that there is no single explosive revelation waiting behind a locked door. No document that would overturn doctrine or expose a grand conspiracy. It is also possible that the real significance of the archive is subtler. Not what it hides, but what it remembers, and what it chooses slowly and deliberately to forget. There is a temptation when thinking about hidden archives to imagine a single room, a locked chamber, a door few people have opened, a shelf with one file on it that would explain everything. But real archives are not like that. They are slow. They are layered. They are administrative. They are full of routine. The most consequential document in a collection is often indistinguishable at first glance from the least consequential one. The same paper, same ink, same handwriting style. The difference lies not in appearance, but in implication. Which means that what the Vatican Archive knows is not contained in one dramatic secret. It is distributed across shelves, across centuries, across categories, a sentence in a letter here, a marginal note in a report there, a decision recorded without commentary. Knowledge does not always arrive as revelation. Sometimes it accumulates quietly until a pattern forms. The difficulty is that only a handful of people have ever seen enough of the archive at once to perceive patterns. Researchers work in fragments, a collection from a specific decade, a correspondence related to a single figure, files tied to one historical event. They build arguments from what they are allowed to see. But no researcher sees the whole. No historian has walked all 53 miles. Even the archivists themselves likely experience the collection in sections, assigned to particular areas, responsible for specific time periods. No single human memory contains the entire map. That fact softens the idea of deliberate omniscience. The Vatican does not have a master index in someone's head that connects every hidden truth. It has an inherited structure, a bureaucracy layered over time. Decisions about preservation and access made by different people under different popes with different priorities. Which means some of the secrecy is intentional, and some of it is inertia. Inertia is rarely dramatic. It is not a conspiracy. It is simply the continuation of a previous decision, because reversing it would require effort and risk. A file remains restricted because it always has been. A catalog remains incomplete because no one has prioritized finishing it. A manuscript remains unpublished because funding and controversy make it inconvenient. And over time, inconvenience becomes policy. There is something almost human about that. We keep boxes in attics, we postpone sorting through them. We tell ourselves we will deal with them later. The Vatican has had centuries of later. And yet there are moments when it chooses differently. Opening the Pew's XII archive in 2020 was not inertia. It was deliberate. It was an acknowledgement that history eventually demands transparency. Publishing the Chinon Parchment was not inertia. It was a decision to clarify a medieval episode that had grown mythic in the absence of documentation. Changing the name from Secret Archive to Apostolic Archive was symbolic. But symbols matter. It was a quiet attempt to shift perception. These actions suggest an institution aware of how secrecy appears in a modern world. But awareness does not eliminate tension. The Vatican's authority rests partly on continuity, on the idea that it has preserved something unbroken from the earliest centuries of Christianity. That claim depends on trust. And trust is strengthened by openness. It is also weakened by exposure. Because exposure reveals human imperfection, the archive, if fully opened without restriction, would almost certainly show mistakes, misjudgments, political compromises, moral failures alongside moral courage. It would show leaders acting with conviction and leaders acting with fear. And perhaps that is the deeper reason archives are opened slowly. Not because they contain monsters, but because they contain people. A pope's writing in uncertainty. A cardinal's negotiating under pressure. Officials choosing what they believed was the lesser evil. There is a quiet humility in recognizing that. It moves the conversation away from hidden villains and toward inherited complexity. But complexity does not erase responsibility. When letters asking for help were filed without action, well, that matters. When financial entanglements blurred ethical lines, well, that matters. When manuscripts were restricted because they complicated doctrine, that matters. An archive is not neutral ground. It is a record of power exercised. And power, even when exercised sincerely, leaves traces. The Vatican Archive knows those traces. It knows where doctrine bent to politics. It knows when diplomacy required silence. It knows which warnings were heeded and which were ignored. Whether those traces will ever be fully visible is uncertain. But history has a way of pressing outward. Documents once sealed become routine. Questions once dangerous become academic. Controversies cool into footnotes. Time reduces the risk of truth. The Vatican understands time better than almost any institution on earth. It has survived empires, revolutions, wars, reformations, the scandals. It knows that revelation delayed is not revelation denied forever. And perhaps that is the final shape of the mystery. Not that there is a single explosive secret waiting, but that the archive holds a living conversation between past and present, and that the pace of disclosure is itself a strategy. Slow enough to preserve authority, open enough to maintain credibility, measured. Like footsteps in a long corridor lined with shelves. As if you could walk that corridor tonight, you would not find drama, you would find boxes, labels, and climate-controlled air, fluorescent light. And inside the boxes, handwriting. Ink that has not faded completely. Names of people who once believed their words would matter. Some of them were right, some of them were forgotten. The archive remembers both, and for now, that is enough. The rest will come, if it comes at all, in its own time. Quietly, as most things do.